the ground, both on the ground at St. John's and also at the rural outreach centers. In fact, for the work that he and his team achieved, 2020, they received kind of a national award from the Indian Association of Preventive and Social Medicine for best practice in community medicine based on this work. So he as most of you know, he leads the initiative for the St. John's Geriatric Center, which is going to be a 130-bed, 7-story standalone facility on the St. John's campus, eventually, which is planned to deliver care, training, and research. So he's been inspiration to many people and kind of the person on the ground who is going to take this initiative forward. And we are thankful that he joined us, which is 6:30 a.m. for him after changing the dates around a few times. Thanks, Arvind. Now I take the privilege of introducing Joe, and it so happens that Joe and Arvind were interns together back, I think,
just a few years ago.
yeah, just a few years ago. Looking at how young they look, it was just a few years ago. And so Joe, uh, uh, after Joe is from the batch of 83, kind of a very prominent researcher he's been at Albert Einstein since then. He's the division chief of the Department of Medical Geriatrics and the director of the Gerontology Center, named after Jack and Pearl Resnick. He has been publishing and kind of leading the field since about 2002, when he started off his career with very prominent NEJM publications that very few kind of have the privilege of kind of having, and he's been on the cutting edge of a lot of studies on cognitive, on early dementia detection with multiple different studies. So the one thing that he learned from St. John's is that if you are walking and talking at the same time and you can do both well, you're less likely to have dementia early on. So that's one of the studies that I think now the NIH is funding him about $8 million to do something of that stature. So he's extremely well funded, has a total funding of about $15 million from the National Institute of Health, doing cutting edge geriatrics research. A lot of he is also doing global health and has collaborators both in India and abroad. So it's a privilege that I know he had a meeting today that he moved aside to be with us to share his thoughts and kind of give some of the where the field is moving. So thanks, Joe, for joining us, and thanks for the for this evening. Vidya will now give some housekeeping remarks.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you to all for joining, both on the US side and in India. And I know we're recording too for others in the UK and other time zones who wanted to join. So I'm really excited to have this talk. I just wanted to mention, if in terms of housekeeping, is just keeping your microphone muted, except when you're talking. As far as any questions, please try to post them in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat if you can, and then we will try to get to as many questions as we can. So I'm hoping we'll have enough time. So I think those should be the main things. If you have any other technology issues, and Sunil Babu is also here, so between us we will address it to the best of our ability. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Vidya. But now, Arvind, we thought with kind of a general fatigue with the virtual format, this was the design that Babu suggested and others kind of vouched was a question and answer format, so that all of us learn from these two thought leaders on either side and initiatives on the ground. and some of the things that can make a difference. So I think Arvind will start off and a conversation between the two of them.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for doing this, for putting this together. Thank you, Jyoti, for those kind words of introduction. Back home, I'm just known as the guy with the bent nose, which is the only visible deformity. There are others. But it's really wonderful. It is, yes, the sun is just peeping out of the clouds here after many days of somewhat heavy rain, a little early in the season, but never mind, whatever is given to us, we accept. So with that, I think that what I would probably start off by doing, I'm going to share a screen, is to start with the bigger picture, so to speak, and then funnel into what Joe has for us. And I entirely agree with what Jyoti said. There's a lot of stuff that he's involved with, which is very exciting for us all to learn. So this is a picture. Sunil picked it spot on. I mean, this is when you can spot a Keralite, the blood running through his veins. He said, this is the Thrissur Puram. It is, in fact, the Thrissur Puram festival. I just put that as a backdrop because we are talking, when we talk about senior citizens in India, we are talking about a huge population, first up. We expect that it is around 138 million. We did not have a census in 2021 for obvious reasons, but we expect that this is the size of the population now, up from something like 32 million 50 years back to 138 now, and that's a huge number. Not just a large number, but we believe that that population is growing. We expect that 1 in 10 people now is aged 60 and above, which is the cutoff to define elderly people in this country. But by the year 2050, we expect that that would be 20%, which is 1 in 5 Indians would then be a senior citizen or an elderly person, which is again a huge number. Anything in India, like all of you know, is huge in terms of numbers. And it just kind of gives you a sense of what we've got to deal with in terms of how do we care for these senior citizens, how do we build in systems for them. That is the perspective with which we look at this large and this growing population. Our life expectancy has crossed 70 years expected now, which is quite an achievement, considering that at the time of independence, or 1950s, we were just at 35 years was the life expectancy at birth, which is somewhat remarkable if you look at it. Of course, accounted for by a huge infant mortality rate at that point. But all said and done, today a median at birth is expected to live to 70 years and beyond. And it is now that we are going to start seeing an explosion of the very old population, that is the 80, 85 and over, and the conditions and issues that come with that large demographic. We still, of course, remain largely rural. 71% of our senior citizen population is rural, which is the part we sometimes don't see. We tend sometimes to look at the cities and our patients at our clinics, but we must remember that that's the tip of a very large iceberg in the rural area. Now, this is another important statistic, which is that if you look within that population at who's vulnerable and who are the people we should really be looking at within that population as priority, we do have this phenomenon of the single elderly woman. Because if you look at within the group of senior citizens, almost 40% of the elderly women have lost their spouse and are single, as compared to elderly men who are sort of better off, with 14% to 15% of them being single. Obviously, because of the fact that men marry women younger than them, and many times men, not many times, men more often remarry than women at a later age. But this is just a vulnerable focus within that population of senior citizens that I thought I'd just bring up. Now, in the midst of this, the WHO has declared that our decade now, where we are right now, is the decade of healthy aging from 21 to 30. So in the midst of this, what are some of the challenges that we look at? Like I said, I look at it broadly, and then we kind of funnel into challenges and issues at an individual level. Now, I've written an editorial in the Indian Journal of Community Medicine where I pose 5 A's as being challenges which face our population, including our senior citizen population. One is the challenge of awareness. Now, when I say awareness, I mean things like health literacy and seniors being aware, self-aware of their health and what they should do to keep themselves going. The second obvious challenge, the second A of the 5 A's, is obviously access. And when I say access, it could be geographic access. How many of our seniors have access to a good health facility geographically? It could be social access. Is there somebody to take them when they need to go? And many other dimensions of access. Affordability is a huge issue. Almost 70% of the healthcare spending in India is in the private sector. And a large proportion of that 70% is spent on medicines and is out of pocket. So for a costly intervention, for something that happens, and we all know the prevalence of chronic disease rises after the age of 60 and 65. So affordability is a huge issue. And these the 4th and the 5th A's have largely to do with the public sector in health, what I call accountability and the absence phenomenon. I mean, you go, okay, fine, you've convinced a senior citizen to actually seek healthcare. And when he goes to the health center, there's nobody there. Or there should have been many things, but nobody actually took care to see that those things were available. So these are the 5 A's that I thought that I would pose as challenges to our own health sector in terms of looking after this huge and growing population of senior citizens. So at this point, I will then funnel now out of this larger perspective and move on to Joe, who's sitting out there looking very bright and fresh at 9 p.m. this evening, and ask him a couple of things. Now, one is, Joe, as a global kind of a question, what are some of the things some of the determinants or the issues that characterize healthy aging? Because if we are talking about this populations of seniors, whether they are in India or whether they are in the US or whether they're anywhere, if we say that we are in the decade of healthy aging, what are those things that determine that a person is aging healthily? And I probably put that as a sort of a global question and pass it on to Joe. And let's hear from him to start off with. And then I'll probably come in a little later, depending on how this is going. Yes, Joe, go, all yours.
Sure. Thanks, Arvind, and thanks to the committee for inviting both of us to take part. And good morning or good evening, wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. And I see a lot of my batchmates have joined too, so it's great to see all of you. That, by the way, in the back of me is the River Nile, and it's not the Bronx or Westchester where I live. My wife is my batchmate, as many of you know, Felicia, and we recently celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary by taking a trip to Egypt. This is actually from the Cataract Hotel where Agatha Christie wrote Death of the Nile. So this is the part of the Nile that is featured in the book as well as in the movie. So a great question, Arvind. The biggest risk factor for any age-related disease is aging. So globally, I think when you look at it at a global perspective, the biggest issue is that populations are aging. You mentioned in India that 1 in 10 people are in the 65 plus, what we would consider in the geriatric age group.
Yeah, 60 plus, actually.
60 plus.
That's what we cut off here. Yeah.
And in the US, it's 65, mostly to do with Medicare and coverage. And here, about 1 in 5 adults fall into the 65 plus group. So it is a growing problem, which is both an opportunity. I think that people are living longer as well. We lived longer than our fathers and mothers' generations, and they lived longer more than their grandparents' generation. So, but along with it is also a challenge in that just the absolute number of people are increasing. So paradoxically, diseases like dementia as a relative prevalence is actually going down. But as an absolute, and as a percentage of the population, there's actually less cases of dementia. And partly it's got to do with people are adopting, gradually, but steadily, more healthier lifestyles. But as absolute numbers go, it is increasing. And the case is even worse in what we call super aging societies like Japan and Korea. Another big issue has to do with socioeconomic disparities between different communities. Mostly the Western populations can afford more expensive medications and investigations into these diseases, though it doesn't always necessarily translate. The people who spend the most don't necessarily get the best medical care, as we know from the case of US. We are, I think, number 2 in terms of per capita medical spending, but somewhere in the 15 or 16 in terms of healthcare indices. But generally, it does follow that if you spend more, you increase longevity, and you have an impact on diseases, mainly by affording better investigations and medications. So I would think that would be the second major issue. And I think the final sort of general issue is that even though there's been lifestyle changes, especially in the Western world, there is sort of an epidemic of obesity, physical inactivity, and sedentariness, which contributes to most of these aging diseases like dementia, disability, and most of the chronic diseases that we have. So I think there's an interaction between all these factors: age, socioeconomic status, and lifestyle changes that's causing these problems globally.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joe. And absolutely, to take on from where Joe just left, the domains of healthy aging, I mean, irrespective of, if you look at the recent systematic reviews, which look at trying to kind of collect all the evidence together and see what is it that makes people age healthily. I think in general, everybody is kind of okay or agrees that the domains generally fall into the physical, the mental and cognitive domain, and the social domain. I mean, these are broadly the 3 areas where I think we all agree that choices and lifestyles in these 3 domains would probably determine how well we age or how healthily we age as we go on. Now, starting off with the physical domain, I think the 2 big elephants in the room as far as physical domain are concerned are physical activity and diet. And there's been a lot of studies which have looked at how physical activity and diet actually helps with health itself. But they now are recognized as very important determinants of aging, of healthy aging. Now, if I were to take the first one, which is physical activity, Joe, would there be any things that you'd want to share on physical activity and its relationship with healthy aging, from the work that you've done, from stuff that you've come up with or you've encountered? What would be your thoughts on physical activity as a determinant of healthy aging?
Yeah, no. So first of all, I agree completely with you, Arvind. I mean, the 2 sort of factors that always come up in definitions of successful aging, as well as if you ask older people, what would they want or what do they consider successful aging? It's good physical health and good cognitive health. That always comes number 1 and 2, or 2 or 1, or the other way around. Now, physical activity, I think at this point, nobody would disagree that having regular physical activity or exercise is good for your health. I think the CDC recommendations in the US, and this might be different in different countries, is that you have to have moderate level exercise 5 days a week for about 30 minutes, which in an aging population, whether it's here or in India, it's a challenge to get people to do that much exercise. There's this general figure that goes around, and I just was reminded of it because there was an article that I came across just today about taking 10,000 steps. That's sort of the number. There's an interesting story behind it in that in the 1960s, when they had the Tokyo Olympics, there was a local manufacturer who wanted to try sell pedometers to get people exercising. And the characters for that looked like 10,000. So the pedometers actually turned out to be very popular. And somehow that 10,000 number, 10,000 steps a day has become like a, part of like an urban myth. And, it's their medical literature. But recent studies have shown that actually you don't need to, for an older person, you don't even need to do that much. So, as physicians, mostly physicians here, setting goals for older people, I think are important. So studies have shown that even if you take as much as 4,000 steps a day, and 4,000 steps would be just about a mile or 1.5 kilometers. And that's good for you. It actually, you start seeing a reduction in mortality risk. Obviously, the more you take, there's better effects. So there's almost like a dose response, and that, the more steps you take a day, it's better. Now, in terms of exercise and health outcomes, the best evidence, as Jyoti would tell you, and Raghavan would tell you, it comes in the cardiac literature. So exercise has been shown to prevent a lot of cardiac events. Surprisingly, the evidence for exercise and dementia, my field, is not there. So a few years ago, I was asked to be an expert on a National Academy of Medicine workshop, and where we reviewed all these risk factors and lifestyle changes. And actually, it was my goal to look at the exercise part. So most of the evidence for exercise in context of dementia comes from what we call observational studies, where you collect, how much people exercise, and then you follow them over a period of time to see who develops dementia. And in these kinds of studies, not all these studies, but about half the studies show that exercises like walking or playing games is associated with reduced risk of dementia. The evidence from randomized clinical trials, however, is not as clear cut. In fact, a lot of clinical trials haven't shown an effect of exercise on preventing risk of either dementia or earlier stages like mild cognitive impairment. There are studies that show specific effects, say, on things like executive function, your ability to plan and pay attention and your working memory. But on dementia risk, it isn't. So one of the reasons we think in our research is that, there's not one, we tend to use a one size fits all approach to exercise. We tell our patients and ourselves that, you need to walk 4,000 or 10,000 steps a day. And that might be good for cardiac outcomes. But if you want doing it for your brain, you might need to modify the way you do it. So there's this concept about cognicize, or cognitively enhanced exercises, where you're doing things like walking while talking, for instance, or you're dancing, which is a cognitively enhanced exercise. So doing exercises that involve more than a physical component probably might have a better effect on these. The other aspect that you talked about, and the flip of the exercise is sedentariness. So a lot of studies have shown that, a lot of people exercise, like me. I exercise the first thing in the morning, but then I'm sitting in front of a computer the rest of the day. And increasingly, we're recognizing even if you exercise, often sedentariness can counter all the beneficial effects of exercise. So it's important to actually maintain physical activity through the day. So telling yourself or your patients that you see that not only they can exercise a bit less in the morning, but they need to, walk around, in the afternoon at lunchtime or in the evening. And just to keep generally active is important, because otherwise you lose all the benefits of exercise. And sedentariness in itself has been linked to risk of dementia. So I think that's important.
Very interesting, Joe. I think important takeaways from this, the definite beneficial. I mean, we talk about 150 minutes of activity a week to our patients, and try to encourage them this 30 minutes of moderate intensity activity at least 5 days a week. And the 10,000 steps, very interesting to see the origins of this. You can bet always that there is a business angle to almost everything, I guess. And of course, I didn't know that the evidence linking exercise and cognitive impairment was not that robust as it is in the case of cardiovascular health. But that's interesting. And important to keep moving through the day rather than just concentrate it all on your 30 minutes in the morning and then sit around the rest of the day. That's also an important takeaway, I guess, for our senior populations. Just moving on briefly to diet. I know that, we all know that we should be eating a lot of fiber, a lot of fruits and vegetables. Now, that's where, in fact, the problem in the Indian populations, we find that the tendency to eat a high carbohydrate rich kind of carbohydrate heavy diet overrides the fruit and vegetable that is incorporated. But against that is the problem that fruits are very expensive now. For the common man on the street, a kilogram of apple, for example, costs anything about 150 to 200 rupees. And that's just 3 apples, perhaps, if you're lucky, 3 or 4. So it's difficult to push a diet with high amounts of fruit with the kind of costs that we have with diet, with fruits and vegetables. That's on the ground here in India. So diet is an important determinant of aging that I think all of us are aware of. And of course, we are also aware of this Japanese term of hara hachi bu. I'm sure you've heard of this term, many of you. Hara hachi bu, meaning eat till you're 80% full. And that is the problem, so to speak, for a lot of us. When we see something that we like, we tend to eat. But the point is that you should stop before you are completely full, and that has apparently been studied in the city of Okinawa in Japan to show that there is a link between this and healthy aging, which the Japanese are famous for. Very briefly, any thoughts on diet, Joe? The role of diet?
Yeah, no, it's very important. And, just taking off from the Okinawa connection, Okinawa is one of the 5 or 6 places around the globe that have been described as blue zones or hot zones, where there are particular populations that live long. And in part, this has been related to the diet they have. I mean, the interesting aspect is the diet in all these zones. So there's Okinawa, there's Sardinia, there is a population in California that's been studied that all have longevity, but the diets are different in all places. So, I think, diet contributes to an extent, but there's not one universal diet that works. But with regard to specific diets, the one that's probably the best studied is the Mediterranean diet. Which is, generally followed in the Mediterranean area, olive oil, a lot of whole grains, more fish, less red meat. And initially it was found to be linked to reduced risk of cancer. And then, like most things, they linked it then to a risk of cardiovascular outcomes. And as dementia people followed later. And recently, there's been work that has actually linked Mediterranean diets to reduce risk of cognitive decline. Now, there's also this concept of Mediterranean style diet, in that you don't have to follow a Mediterranean diet, but you look at the elements of your diet that are close to the Mediterranean in the sense, are you eating less fat? Are you having more protein intake, either from fish or from legumes? And, that probably is related to. I think I quickly saw a question about turmeric. So I think that probably is highly relevant to all of us. Who doesn't take turmeric in this crowd? There was a study in Singapore, where they have three races. They have Indians, Malays, and Chinese. And in the Singapore aging study, they actually looked at the diet and found that increased consumption of turmeric was associated with reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease. And turmeric, of course, the ingredient is curcumin, which has an anti-inflammatory effect. I see one about calorie restriction. Calorie restriction itself, I don't think has been related to reduced risk of Alzheimer's, but I think more recently, and there was an article in the New England Journal about that, intermittent fasting has been associated with better metabolic health, though again, it's not been related to Alzheimer's. So intermittent fasting, which I intermittently follow, is the concept that you leave a period of time where you don't eat. So for instance, unlike an Indian practice, if you eat around 6 or 7 in the evening, then your next meal has to be after like 12 in the afternoon. So you take lunch. So you basically have an early dinner or supper, and then you don't eat anything until you have your light lunch, and then you can have dinner again. And this has been related to better metabolic indices, including aging factors. Part of this is because it works on multiple pathways that are involved in aging, like serotonin pathways. Interestingly, the same concept, because not everybody can do this. People have been trying to find a pill that can mimic a lot of these effects. So probably the one that's the best known in the US, at least, is metformin. So metformin is kind of like an anti-aging pill in that it affects multiple aging pathways. So a colleague of mine called Nir Barzilai is actually been setting up a study in the US called the TAME study. And the idea is that they're giving metformin not to treat diseases like Alzheimer's or dementia, but to treat aging. And because aging is the biggest risk factor for all these diseases. So if you can improve your metabolic pathways related to aging, maybe you can delay the onset of all these diseases. And interesting, the study actually hasn't started in the US, but it's already been featured in Science and Nature in almost every major publication over here.
Great, thanks, Joe. That was very interesting indeed. I do see the chat box is getting quite busy with questions. Intermittent fasting, calorie restriction, and turmeric were 3 questions that came up. Also, I think Kamal has a question for you, Joe, which we can probably take up. We've got the last few minutes to take up questions. We could probably address it there. Just moving on with the domains of healthy aging. The next big domain is, of course, the mental domain. And this is a very interesting thing because ultimately it is, I'm fond of telling my students that your world is more between your ears than around it, kind of a thing, in the sense that it's ultimately what you actually have in there. So 4 big determinants in the mental and cognitive area are what they call self-awareness or the perception of self, the attitude and outlook that one has, the habit of lifelong learning, and of course, the concept of faith or spirituality. Now, these are 4 things that came up in when we looked at reviews on healthy aging and the mental domain. And self-awareness includes resilience and self-esteem. These are very interesting simply because they deal with the core of the matter, according to me, in the sense that how you perceive things and how you take things and what is your response. The world is presented to you, but what is your response? That's what these domains really talk about. So any thoughts on these, Joe? I mean, lifelong learning and spirituality and faith and attitude and outlook, and that their relationship to healthy aging.
Yeah, I mean, the whole issue about personality changes that you mentioned last, I mean, that's really fascinating. There's been work that personality traits such as neuroticism, the tendency to worry too much, is being linked to risk of dementia, whereas personality traits like openness are associated with reduced risk. Unfortunately, these are traits, so they supposedly don't change. So it's if you're like born with it, then you're more at risk. And of course, all these aren't like unideterminate, and that just because you have a worrying personality doesn't mean that you will necessarily get dementia, because you can do other things to avoid it. And I think one of the most things that I'm personally interested in is the role of these lifestyle changes, especially engaging in cognitively stimulating activities. And I think that's probably one of my claims to fame, is being among the earliest people to describe the association between engaging in cognitively stimulating activities like playing crossword puzzles or board games or musical instruments and reduced risk of dementia. So there's been a number of studies that have actually shown that people who keep their mind mentally active by engaging in any of these activities have a reduced risk. Interestingly, there was a study a few years ago out of England where they compared the effects of engaging in these activities in Alzheimer's patients versus actually taking the treatments that were available. And the effect sizes were actually bigger for cognitively stimulating activities. So at any stage, before when you're healthy, if you're having mild complaints, or even if you have a dementia patient, it's important to get them to engage in mentally stimulating activities. So that is important. And over the years, I think there are a few sort of basic rules in that the activities that you advise people to take part in should be fun, because it's got to be a lifestyle change. And if they don't enjoy it, they're not going to do it. They have to do it frequently enough, in that they have to do it as many times during the week as they can. So which means that just not focusing on one activity. So you don't do crossword puzzles for 5 hours a day for 7 days a week, but you take a mix of activities, puzzles or walking or dancing, and mixing them up, I think is great. And then they've got to be challenging. So if you're doing crossword puzzles, and you start finding that it's easy to do, or your patients say that it's easy to do, then you can step up. I especially like crossword puzzles because you can start off with simple ones that are geared towards children, and this is mostly for my dementia patients, and then ask them to step up because they're clear grading of puzzle difficulties. Or if you're like in the New York area and the New York Times reader, the puzzles go in difficulty from Monday to Friday. So you can actually grade at what level, you have difficulty. And I tell my patients, actually, it's good that, you're having difficulty, because that shows your brain is working harder. There's a lot of work from animal studies that show that if you take mice and expose them to enriched environments, which is the mice equivalent of playing puzzles and games, it actually stimulates neurogenesis in the brain and improves synaptic connections. So a lot of the biological evidence comes from animal studies that show that these activities might have a benefit. Related to that, there's been a great interest in like brain games and using brain games to improve. We just finished a clinical trial that we published earlier this year in one of the Lancet subjournals, and we did a randomized control trial where we got people to either play computer games intensively versus less intensively. Both the groups actually improved in their cognitive function, but compared to each other, they didn't actually show great effects, which kind of questions the whole approach to brain games and computer games and how much you need to do. But in generally, doing more is better. So, those are some of my thoughts on that. But I think it's a very important area.
Lovely. I mean, it's good to take away this from take away something from this webinar, and I guess with the Friends of St. John's Academic Group from the webinars that we're going to have. And this is a very important takeaway, which is evidence does show that doing cognitively stimulating activity like your daily Sudoku or your crossword puzzle or something like that does help in keeping your main brain nimble. I can see Raghavan's question of coffee. I mean, it was too tempting to sort of keep for later. And I'm a diehard coffee drinker here, filter, I mean, the good old South Indian filter coffee, so to speak. A quick thought on that, Joe. I mean, I know that there's been studies which do show that there is a link between coffee and cognitive function. I can vouch for it, at least for the first half hour of the morning, after which it kind of dot. But any thoughts on that very quickly before we move to the next domain?
Yeah, I think, especially in terms of short-term improvement in alertness and cognitive function, there is. I think there've been a few studies that have shown that, but kind of related to it, chocolate does help. So it contains, flavonols, and that's been associated with improved cerebral blood flow and probably cognition.
Thanks,
at this
thanks.
point, I think if you like coffee, drink it,
Absolutely. The question is how much and where to stop. I mean, 5 cups a day, 20 cups.
Right.
Just go on. I saw a question from Selvin. Hi, Selvin, which was to do with attitude and positivity. I think that also has been shown to have an effect on cognitive well-being. Having a positive outlook, a positive attitude, and being generally positive in the way that you are. Joe did mention about chronic worriers, sort of a thing, being more prone to cognitive impairment. Well, the third big domain of healthy aging is the social domain, where we look at engagement and this classically has components like volunteerism, keeping in touch, being engaged, staying connected with friends, and things like that. And of course, the big issue of social and financial security are also important for healthy aging. But I think that as far as engagement with friends, engagement with organizations, maybe volunteering, keeping in touch, being a member of a group of people, these things have been shown to definitely positively impact healthy aging. What are your thoughts on this, Joe?
Yeah, so, about like 20 years ago, there was an interesting study that came out of Sweden, which, reported that people who have bigger social networks, in terms of they interact more with more people, had a reduced risk of dementia. So there are two aspects of social interaction. There's social networks, how many people you interact with, and the level of social support. How much support do you think you get from those? And the Swedish studies show that people with more networks did better. But then there have been other studies that have come up with really funny findings. So there was a study from Taiwan that showed that it mattered who you interacted in your network. So interaction with family didn't really help. Interaction with friends really did. So all of you have reduced your risk of getting dementia by at least 1% by just being here on this webinar. And this study, which I probably should have mentioned, but there was in the English aging study, they found that for men, having a wife was associated with reduced mortality as well as reduced risk of dementia. For women, it didn't really matter. It was having friends. So, so I think the whole social network is complex. In the study that we're doing in India called the Carol Einstein study, when we started looking at social networks, it didn't work because by the time you step out of your door in India, you've already met like 30 people. So everybody has networks running into the hundreds, unlike Sweden. Yeah, in Sweden, you probably meet 30 people in the whole village, over the year. But in India, it doesn't work. So maybe the quality of those connections, like the English, keep good with your wife, and if your wife, make sure you have an escape and some friends.
Thanks, Joe. That was great. Now we are 10 minutes away from the scheduled end of this webinar, and I know that Vidya is going to coordinate the questions that we kind of be taking up. Vidya, would you like to do that? I just want about 3 minutes or 4 minutes later just to update you all on the St. John's Geriatric Center and where we are.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think maybe the obstructive sleep apnea, there was a question on that with early dementia, and then the hormone supplementation. I think those were two big ones. There was a question on alcohol, and so I don't know if that you want to comment on if we have time.
Persistent on the alcohol question.
Yes, but at least the hormone supplementation and the sleep apnea.
All right. Well, we could do the alcohol too.
Yeah.
So sleep apnea is interesting because that is, first of all, it's underdiagnosed. I think my friend and batchmate Carmel's on it. Maybe it's Carmel's question. Carmel knows this more than I do, but it is often undiagnosed or ignored. And it's definitely linked to poor brain outcomes in terms of vascular damage in the brain, and is also linked to cognitive impairment. In our clinic, in our dementia clinic, because we use an interdisciplinary approach. So unlike most clinics where you refer to a neurologist, in our dementia center, the patient gets seen by a geriatrician first, and then has neuropsychologists and the neurology assessments. As part of this geriatrician assessment, we do something called a stop bank questionnaire. And it is sort of a set of screening questions that you just ask questions. And if they answer yes, then we proceed to recommending tests for sleep apnea. So that's definitely in. The hormone therapy, it depends on which hormone. So in women, the Women's Health Initiative is a large-scale clinical trial that did hormone replacement in women. Actually showed detrimental effects of hormone replacement on dementia outcome in women. So women who were on hormone replacement actually had increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, as well as, I think, stroke. So that's not in favor. For men, right from the time of Brown's Accord, people have been looking at things like testosterone replacement and growth hormone replacement, which is a biggie over here. The problem with growth hormone replacement, especially, despite it, in addition to its metabolic problems, is that it interferes with IGF production, and low IGF levels in older people has been linked in turn to dementia risk. So it's not recommended for hormone replacement. Alcohol, that's sort of a vexed question in geriatrics, because as an epidemiologist, as much as you try to show that alcohol is bad for you, it isn't. So, in epidemiological studies.
What a lovely way to start the day here.
Moderate alcohol intake. I'm not talking about heavy alcohol intake, but moderate. Well, moderate is almost always the level that I drink, right? And anything more than that is heavy. But I remember reading a paper by Selim Yusuf and his group where they were looking at many risk factors for mortality. And alcohol was protective, and they had a sentence saying that that they didn't recommend that people start drinking because of this was a Lancet paper. And many years later, when we looked at alcohol and many other risk factors in terms of developing risk for slow gait, alcohol turned out to be protective again. So NIH actually tried to do a clinical trial where they were going to randomize people into drinking or not drinking, but there were some ethical conflicts with the sponsors who were, I think, either Diego or one of the big alcohol companies. So that didn't go forward. The jury fell out on that. I believe it's good for you. In moderation. You
got your answer. I do see a few more questions. Vidya, how shall we do this? Shall I just complete this thing and then we?
Yeah, Sunil will tell us as far as time, because can we stay on, just maybe answer the questions after, or we can finish the main part of it and do the questions? Sunil, what do you recommend?
Yeah, I think let's have Arvind present or discuss.
Yes, and then we can address some of the other questions. I know Maya has a question on some kind of stimulation devices for cognition. And then, yeah, so there's a few. So why don't, Arvind, why don't we let you present, so that way, if we have to come back and answer questions, that way people have to leave in the interest of time. But yeah, let's go ahead.
I'll just take a few minutes more. This is what you see on your screen is the architect's impression of what we think the St. John's Geriatric Center will look like in hopefully about 2 years from now. Well, this, for those of you who are not very conversant with what I'm talking about, the St. John's Geriatric Center is a dream project which has finally got off the ground. And we have about an acre of land which has been given to us by St. John's on the campus of the hospital to set it up. And this is what it is. It's a fourfold mission that we are trying to carry forward to basically stimulate interest and action and practice and training on elder care. That's what this thing, we're hoping that will be a beacon of sorts for elder care in this part of the country. So these are the 4 things that it stands on. Care, where we have about 100, here it says 123, but still we're just kind of trying to see how many we can fit in, probably 125 to 130 beds on 7 floors. We have facilities for daycare, short-term care of 4 to 6 weeks, maybe a floor for long-term care, and definitely 2 floors for hospice care or end-of-life care. So that's what this center's care function will be. We also hope that we will have a robust training facility. We've got a nice classroom planned there. We've got a nice multi-purpose hall for our community engagement function that we hope will happen with the elders in the community. And of course, on the 3rd floor, we've got a nice research center on aging and geriatrics. In fact, we've called it the CRAG, the Center for Research on Aging and Geriatrics. That's what it's going to be called. So at the moment, this is what it kind of started off as, this bottom thing on the panel blowing clockwise. That's the foundation stone, which was blessed last year. This is the site itself, which was marked out earlier. And today we are in a position to say that we've broken ground, and the first footing has been actually placed. That's what you see on the corner. That's a footing for the crane, which is going to come and sit over there. And the construction is finally begun after months and months of delay with governmental sanctions. So these are just the milestones where we were. We got approval for the St. John's Geriatric Center from the governing board of St. John's in 2020. We started our fundraising activity because what St. John's has given us the land, but we are trying to raise the funds to build and equip the center. So we've got a big target of 40 crores of rupees, which is roughly US $5.5 million or so. We started our fundraising in August 2020. My sincere thanks to many people in the Friends of St. John's who've actually already supported us to some extent. Thank you very, very much indeed. 2021, we moved forward. We made some groups. In fact, we created a research cluster of which Joe is an integral part. All these groups have been dormant for the past about 8 months or so when we got stuck with sanction and our plan sanctions and things like that. Finally, we've got some breakthrough there. The next few days, we should get it in hand, but we've started construction just a few days back. And we are expecting that it will take about 21 months or so to complete, February 2024. So of this target of $5.5 million, we've got commitments for almost half to 55% of that. We're very fortunate in having 3 or 4 local donors who've come forward with large amounts of money. And of course, the Friends of St. John's have also been quite active and have done their bit as well. We look forward to much more participation as we go on. I must mention, of course, Marian. I saw his name among the participants. Marian himself is a firebrand for our geriatric initiative, like all of you know, and he personally has also committed a large sum of money. So thank you very much, Friends of St. John's, Marian specifically, and the others. And this is where I will stop and hand it back to Vidya and Sunil. I'll stop sharing. Yeah. Yes, Vidya, back to you.
Yeah, I think there were just a few quick questions. So one about AFib, any correlation with the AFib and dementia, And then again, some like supplements in terms of like diet, I guess, coconut oil, and then supplements like B12 and folate, or any other, I guess, supplements in that category.
Well, atrial fibrillation quickly, yeah. I mean, there definitely is a relationship to that. So in a typical case, say for Alzheimer's, there's almost no point in doing an MRI. The only point in doing an MRI is to detect, as a neurologist, is to detect vascular damage. And if you do, I think your suspicion for things like cardiac irregularities or arrhythmias goes up, and that should be investigated. Again, that's potentially, a great opportunity to remove a continuing risk factor and prevent further damage. B12 and folate, I mean, it's recommended that you check B12 and folate. So, we do that. The yield isn't that great, but if you do find a case where it's low, again, it's something that's correctable. So I would, definitely recommend that. B12 certainly more than folate.
Especially like vegetarian diets, right?
Yeah,
So, yeah.
I think that's important. And in the US, people from certain area, like where you have the risk of celiac disease or Irish origin, those are some of the other populations that you would worry about in that.
And then coconut oil,
Yeah.
near and dear to.
I think Raghavan or Jyoti could tell more about it, but I think today it's in. Yeah, coconut oil is good for you. My local Costco sells it, and people are pooling, right? That seems like a horrible thing coming from India, where you gargle with coconut oil. Well, why waste all that goodness? But as far as dementia, I'm not aware of anything specifically that's linked to either pro or con.
Okay.
Dementia.
And I think one last one, did I miss? Maya had a question about the stimulation. I was trying to understand. Did I miss?
Oh yeah, so I think there are like 3 categories of stimulation that like great interest. That's studies are just coming out, and in fact we are doing a neurostimulation study. So the 3 types of stimulation. One is transcranial direct current stimulation, which is basically something like taking a battery and attaching the leads to your head and stimulating your brain. It sounds like like crazy, but actually well-conducted studies have shown that this low degree of electric stimulation actually has effect on specific cognitive functions. So we are currently doing an NIH-funded study, a clinical trial, where we are giving either stimulation or sham stimulation to Alzheimer's patients to see if it improves cognitive function. The other type of stimulation is TMS, transmagnetic stimulation, and that's also very much similar to the TDCS, has shown some promising results. The one that's the most newest is gamma stimulation of the gamma waves in the brain. And in a series of studies that came out of MIT just in the last couple of years, they've shown that animals that had gamma stimulation almost cleared all their Alzheimer's pathology in the brain. And that is, something really fascinating to think that either by magnetism or electricity or just manipulating the brain waves, you can clear Alzheimer's pathology or improve cognition. Initially I was very skeptical when I was hearing about this, because if you go on the internet, you can actually get the TDCS device, and what they can teach you how to create a TDCS, the battery stimulation device. So it seemed out there, but well-conducted studies have shown promise for all of this. So in the US, they came up with a national Alzheimer plan about 10 years ago. And since then, there's been a great, push on research. And a lot of this research is coming out from this increased funding that's been pushed into Alzheimer's.
No, just to sort of the last minute of this, there were some studies from Australia which had something about ultrasonic stuff in the
I forgot that. Yeah,
the plaques or something like that.
That's right. Yeah. So it's low frequency ultrasound was shown to also clear Alzheimer's pathology. Now, most of these studies, by the way, are either animal studies or like phase 1 studies. So, I mean, they're all promising, but, they're not ready for prime time. Though, if you go on YouTube or the internet, you can see a lot of examples of either how to create one of these devices, which I wouldn't recommend doing, or Yeah, like currently in our study, we thought this TDCS was practically without side effects until we tried it in older people, and some of them were getting skin ulcerations on the stimulation site, and so you got to be careful with that.
Okay.
Thanks.
I know we're like really almost out of time, but I know one of the things was where the field is going next. Is there anything major that you would like to talk about?
It's going next with Joe and Arvind kind of leading the path.
Yes.
Well,
So,
I think just in a minute, I think there's a lot of advances in early diagnosis. We're recognizing that the early parts of dementia is not just memory loss, but there are effects on work that I do is looking at gait changes very early on, but there's changes in your smell, there's changes in your mood, and we're using all that to diagnose cognition changes early. We've created a number of simple tests. In fact, Arvind and I have collaborated on picture-based tests that can be used in clinics in India, and actually is being used in the US as well. And then I think treatments are coming out that are really exciting. And we mentioned all these stimulation devices, but and most recently there was a spectacularly unsuccessful drug which was FDA approved against objection, which I don't believe really works, but I think it's good for the field because it stimulates the next successful drug, and there's already 3 out there that are in late phase clinical trials. So I think when I was a medical student and in my early sort of residency training, there were many neurological diseases for which I thought I'll never ever see a cure, or other diseases, multiple sclerosis, HIV, a lot of you probably remember those HIV days when you didn't want to touch patients almost. So, but all of them found cures, or at least stabilizing medications. And I'm very optimistic. I'm very glass half full regarding the future of Alzheimer's treatment. If my regular alcohol doesn't help me, hopefully, in a few years there'll be really good medications that will help me.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then, we do have another question from our Maya in India. So she says there's a huge need to respond to the complaint from the elderly that I can't sleep and so many are on sedatives. What do you recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, sedatives in general are contraindicated in elderly. We have what's called the Beers criteria for geriatrics, which lists, drugs that shouldn't be used, and sedatives are right up there. The increased risk for falls. Finding alternate ways. Here we use things like chamomile tea, melatonin, sleep regulation, better sleep hygiene and habits, all of that. And sleep is only emerging now as a risk factor for dementia. I mean, we used to know that patients with dementia didn't sleep well, but people who don't sleep well are at increased risk for dementia. So these, along with things like deafness, that's another thing that we thought was just interfering with testing, but now we're realizing deafness in itself could be a risk factor for dementia. So there's these multiple of these factors that are emerging. I know we don't have time, but please feel free to reach out to me, with questions. We do. I'm just going to share the screen if I can, just for a sec, to show you. So that's one of the picture-based tests that we use, and a similar version was used by Arvind's group in Bangalore, and we use this in Kerala, and in the US we are using it in multiple sites. So we have like simple picture-based tests like that you don't really require a doctor to give. You can train somebody in your office to give it. So if you're interested in any of this, just reach out to me. We're giving these items away, for anybody who's interested, and the instructions. We've trained community health workers in Kerala to give this, so it's very easy to learn how to use this. So please, feel free to reach out to me.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think that was the time we had for this. So I think, Raghavan, you want to just wrap up real quick?
I want to thank you both for this really outstanding Q&A. And not many Johnites know that Joe Verghese is one of the most accomplished Johnites in the US. He's very humble about it. And Arvind is on the other side of the pond in India. So this was a great Q&A, and I'm sure this recording will be well received, and it's been very thought-provoking. And we are requesting the participants to give us suggestions for future similar sessions. Maybe we can have more of this session itself, because I'm sure this Q&A has provoked more questions and thoughts, and we may have a take two maybe a few months down the road. Thank you both for this outstanding session, and thank the organizers Jyoti and Vidya and Sunil Babu for making this happen. Thank you. Have a good night and a good morning for everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone. Thank you so much. That was really nice. And thank you for the updates from St. John's. That was great to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.